All right, in the last class we discussed that God made a garden, which is really his home. This is his temple, and we are his priests that we're going to take care of the garden. And then something happens. We got kicked out of the garden. And this is not good because outside of the garden, what exactly is what happened? Well, we wanted to know what evil is. And evil always means not being in the presence of God. God doesn't permit evil, because evil is chaos. Chaos means death. It's the death zone. And God doesn't like death zones. God likes gardens. So anybody that's, so evil belongs to the death zone. So when we introduce that into our lives, when we rebel against God, what we're doing is evil means you're turning your back against God, and then you're walking away God. And where do you go? You go out of God's presence, and you're walking out of the garden, and you end up in a death zone. That's why death is always associated with sin, because what you're doing is really you're just turning your back on God, and you're leaving the beautiful garden to out of the presence of God, and now you're in this death zone, and which is a desert or on a water ball. And so that's what happens here, is that we chose to know what evil is. And if you want to experience what evil is, that's evil. Evil is turning your back on God and walking away from God's presence, being out of his presence. So now you have a relationship difference in the death zone. You see that Adam and Eve are blaming each other for the sin. They Cain and Abel, they fight and they kill each other. So you can see that there's a lot of death and dying. It's hard to grow things outside of God's Garden of Eden. It's even having birth is painful. So producing life and being productive life, which was easy in the garden, now becomes very difficult when you're in a death zone. So that's really the problem. So now God is trying to get us back into the garden, but what do we keep doing? We keep turning our back on God, and we keep walking back out of the garden. So that's what we have, the flood. The flood, the symbol of Noah's flood, was a symbol of the death zone that we walked. That it's not good. It's a symbol of that we have turned our back on God, and now we are in a death zone. And so we keep going back. God tries to draw us in, tries to save Noah, and we turn, and then we go to then there's the Tower of Babel, and God has to disperse us. Now there's chaos, and that's all chaos and death and sin. All of that is what happens in the death zone. None of that happens when you're in the garden. Everything is, when you're in the garden, you're just happy, and you got, like, remember always the Superdome. You're in there, you're being entertained, lots of food. God's she's showing the greatness. And when you're in the death zone, it's entirely different. You're miserable, you're suffering, and you die, and things are in flux, things are chaotic. Things are, people want to destroy things and be very destructive, and you're no longer in that beautiful garden anymore. So that's the problem of, so right at the beginning of Genesis sets up the problem that God has made his presence available to us, and we have rejected it. And so these symbols of gardens and death zones are, that's what happens. Now here's the nice thing. Here's the hopeful message in all of this, that God is really good at taking death zones and turning them into gardens. That's what God does. He's creative. We saw that right at the very beginning. So we find ourselves in a death zone. We can turn to God and ask God, gee, can you show your greatness again and show us the garden? So that's the idea here, is that even though we find ourselves and we walk out of it and we end up in a death zone, we can always turn back to God and say, God, I would want to be back into the garden again. But the problem we're having here is, as soon as we get in the garden, we walk away. We step out of the garden. We're always tending toward going against God and wanting evil in our life and turning so that we're cast out of the garden. So how do you get us back in the garden again permanently, so we're always going to be there and not walk away? God has a plan. It's a really good plan. And we're going to talk about that plan. It's called Plan Abraham. We'll talk about that in the next video.